flow. So welcome to Stairwell Chronicles Live. This is my second installment. I'm Dr. Jane Morgan. I know some of you, certainly, I know some of you personally. I know some of you from social media, like Mr. Jerry Morgan. And I do something called the Stairwell Chronicles, where I give some information in 60 seconds or less. And it mostly has been about COVID because I lead the COVID task force at Piedmont Healthcare. So I take a single question about COVID and I answer that question in 60 seconds or less, sitting right here on these steps. So it's called the Stairwell Chronicles. Last month, I started Stairwell Chronicles Live, where I'm going to be talking about topics other than COVID, and it gives us 30 minutes to go a little bit more in depth, but not too long to exhaust you. And hopefully we have opportunities as well as we progress through the summer to have a more interactive format. So last month, I talked about the intersection of heart disease and COVID, and people found that very, very helpful and enlightening to understand what are going to be the cardiovascular implications of COVID once we're on the other side of that. And what does the data show? What does the research show? Today, I want to talk about clinical trials, and it's going to be the first part of a two-part series. The second part will be next month. It will be April 25th, and I'm specifically going to focus on minority populations and populations of color. So this is the first part. And when we talk about clinical trials, I just want to level set because I don't know what people think about clinical trials and where everybody is in maybe their understanding of what clinical trials are. So let's just start with that. So a clinical trial, and maybe I should start with, it's not an experiment, and we're not there to harm people. A clinical trial is where we have an investigational compound or a drug or a device from a drug company or a pharma company or a vaccine company or a device company. And we're getting information on it to determine whether or not it is safe, whether or not it's efficacious, meaning it actually does what it says it's going to do. It treats the disease process, and then whether or not the FDA is going to approve it. So those are the steps. And generally there are 4 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. Phase 1 is where we actually take healthy volunteers, people who don't actually have the disease, and just get an idea of what we call what the pharmacodynamics are on people. And then phase 2 is when we look specifically for doses. We might test 2 or 3 different doses and see, is there a dose that is better than one of the other doses? And then phase 3 are these huge trials that you hear about. You've heard about them with Pfizer and Moderna with the vaccine trials, where we have 30 and 40,000 people and 50 and 60,000 people, where it goes out really to a mass recruiting. And really what we're looking for there is efficacy. Does it do what it says it's going to do? So first, we look for safety. Second, we find the right dose. And third, we want to make certain that it actually does what it says it's going to do. So when we look at clinical trials, that's really where we are with clinical trials. So what is the first step? The first step, if you are approached for a clinical trial, and I hope after we have this conversation, you will bring this up to your physician, are these inclusion and exclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria, there'll be a list of things that we want people to have in order to qualify for the trial. You may need to have diabetes, or you may need to be a certain age, or you may need to be living in a certain demographic. You may need to be on specific medications. And then exclusion criteria is just the opposite. Maybe there's certain medications we want to make sure you're not on, or we might have some other clinical conditions we want to make sure you don't have, like cancer, etc. So why are all of these things important? There's something called optimization or priming. You may or may not know these terms. Physicians may or may not know them as well, depending on how steeped you are in research. But what that means is, let's say I am interested in a clinical trial and I have diabetes and it's a diabetes trial, or maybe it's a hypertension trial, and you can get in if you have diabetes, but your HbA1c, which is a measure of long-term diabetic control, is too high. Let's say the inclusion criteria says it must be that value, that diabetes value, HbA1c must be 8 or less. And let's say I come in to be tested for this trial and mine is 10. Instead of just excluding me, what happens is, especially at the better research centers, is we have a period of optimization where we bring the patient in repeatedly and work on lowering their diabetes level. Imagine that. You've got a team of people working to bring your diabetes level down to where it should have been in the first place. All of these visits, by the way, are not at your cost. You have a research nurse working with you, a research coordinator. Your physician is overseeing them. You have, once you're in the trial, there's a local physician overseeing the regional physician. There's a local physician overseeing your personal physician, a regional physician overseeing the local physician, a national physician overseeing the regional physician. You have an entire team of people just focusing and ensuring that you are healthy and well during the entirety of this clinical trial. Where else do you get healthcare like that, where there's an entire team of people just fussing around you? And your research coordinator, your research nurse, you have access to that person via email, via portal, via phone call. So if you are to develop any type of side effect or any symptom that is concerning to you during the course of this trial, you can contact that person. Imagine that. I don't even have somebody I can contact at any time. And I'm a cardiologist and work in research. But if you are in a clinical trial, that's just how dedicated we are to ensuring that not only people remain healthy in the trial, but they also don't leave the trials because they're not getting good care. So if you have chronic medical conditions and those medical conditions are not well controlled, enrolling in a clinical trial that requires those medical conditions to be controlled improves your health, because the team now is going to prime you. They spend 2, 3, 4 months ahead of actually enrolling you, making certain that we can get these metrics where they should be. That includes if your blood pressure is too high. We work to bring your blood pressure down so you can qualify for the trial. Imagine that. This is maximal healthcare. This is the healthcare behind the screen that many people don't get an opportunity to see. And so when we think about that, we have to think as well about access and why is it that we may or may not participate in these clinical trials. Let's think a bit about oncology trials. If you're still sort of thinking about it, oncology meaning cancer trials. In cancer trials, in particular, the trials themselves, not the drug that is subsequently approved by the FDA later to be used as a chemotherapeutic agent or some type of medical intervention. I'm talking about actually being in an oncology trial, a cancer trial. The cancer clinical trials have been demonstrated again and again just by participating in the trial. You increase your rate of remission of cancer just by participating in the trial. What is that worth to you? What if you get another year on your life? What if you get only 6 months? What if you get 2 months? What if you get only a week? Is a week worth it to you for your quality of life, to be involved with your loved ones? Again, not the approved drug, just being in the trial. Why wouldn't you participate in a cancer trial, specifically if they are cancers that are impactful to you? For cancer specific to women, ovarian cancer, breast cancer, uterine cancer, cervical cancer, and then cancers that are specific to men, prostate cancer, testicular cancer. And then generally, what are we talking about? We're talking about everything. We're talking about meningiomas, we talk about brain cancer, we talk about colon cancer, GI, stomach, any type of cancer that you can think of. Being enrolled in a clinical trial prolongs your life. And yet We don't know about it. It's one of those hidden aspects, and it just sort of is business as usual. And we've got to begin to start to step up and think about what are clinical trials and how do they really, really advantage somebody. So let's take a look at it from another perspective. Clinical trials offer you the opportunity to access tomorrow's therapy today. If you don't think that's valuable, let me give you an example. When Donald Trump was the president of the United States and he contracted COVID, 74 years old, overweight, sitting in the White House, every physician in the United States of America understood that when a helicopter arrived to take him to Walter Reed Hospital, he was desaturated. He was in trouble, meaning his oxygen levels were dropping. Regardless of the stonewalling that the official Walter Reed physicians did in those multiple press conferences of no information, doctors knew that he was desaturating. What happened to Donald Trump when he reached Walter Reed Hospital? He received an immediate infusion of something that no one had heard of at that time outside of research. He received an infusion of an investigational compound called monoclonal antibodies. That infusion was credited with interrupting his downward trajectory of desaturation of oxygen leaving his body and potentially saving his life. He received that drug under emergency use authorization, presumably as the president of the United States. The only other people in the entire world who had access to that infusion were people who were enrolled in the clinical trials. Nobody and nobody else. His privilege and position granted him access to something that the rest of us don't have access to because we aren't aware of it. And so that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about access to tomorrow's therapies today. Monoclonal antibodies were not even available. And yet here's an example for the entire world to see of somebody accessing a clinical trial and having life-saving therapy. When you think about these types of things when you're visiting your physician, and you've got a chronic medical condition, especially if you have a chronic medical condition. My background is cardiology. I'm a formally trained cardiologist. If you've got heart disease, if you've got high blood pressure, hypertension, if you have diabetes, if you got high cholesterol, if you are obese, which is a chronic medical condition, obesity, then you need to seriously think about whether or not you should enroll in a clinical trial. Imagine my first example of optimizing or priming a patient just such that they can qualify for the trial. You now have brought their diabetes under control just such that they can qualify for the trial. Do you know how much you have impacted that person's life and how much you have impacted your own life by allowing yourself to be optimized to enroll in that trial? Diabetes is a serious risk factor for heart disease, for heart failure. Not only that, neurologic conditions, blindness. So just by attempting to qualify for that trial, you have decreased your risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So think about that when you start to conceptualize and try to understand what do clinical trials mean in 2022, and should I be seeking them out? Now you might ask yourself, I've never been offered a clinical trial. I don't know anything about clinical trials. My doctor doesn't talk to me about clinical trials. And the reason for that is multifaceted. One, most of us, including myself, as we come through medical school, are trained in clinical trials, right? We're trained in clinical management of the patient. Research is not a part of medical school training traditionally. So it's something that if we learn about it, we learn about it later. Secondly, these big drug companies, device companies, pharma companies recruit physicians to be principal investigators. That's the lead doctor of these trials. By and large, they recruit white male physicians. That's also the reason we see a preponderance of white males enrolled in these trials as well. And so we have to begin to think about, what does it look like for women? What does it look like for populations of color, as we start to try to encourage more and more people to access this type of care? If you have a chronic medical condition and you are seeing your physician for this chronic medical condition, and you have not even discussed a clinical trial that may be helpful to you, then you are being treated optimally, meaning to the absolute top of excellent medical care for every FDA-approved therapeutic available, but you are not being treated maximally. Maximally is that secret behind that curtain. Maximally is what Donald Trump's team gave him access to. That's the secret of clinical trials. What if you are a physician or even a patient and you don't have insurance, or maybe you have insurance that's not that great, you are underinsured? Think about this. When you are approached for a clinical trial, if you meet the criteria, these inclusion criteria for a clinical trial, and you are enrolled in this clinical trial, by and large, these big companies will now take care of your health care for the duration of the time that you are in these trials. This is how you access health care. If you are uninsured or underinsured, this is how you access health care. And most clinical trials will last for a minimum of a year, sometimes out to 2 years. And these are not necessarily active appointments. It just means that they follow you for a period of time. So you're still enrolled in that trial and data is still being collected for you. If you are struggling to have healthcare, if you've got patients in your practice who are struggling, clinical trials offer them access to healthcare for the duration of the time that they are in a clinical trial. And before everybody runs out and enrolls in a clinical trial, let me tell you some of the do's and don'ts. You can only enroll, for the most part, there might be some exceptions, you can only enroll in one clinical trial at a time. So you can't enroll in one and then go somewhere else, enroll in another, and then go somewhere else. And there should be a database where people are talking. So you're supposed to be in one clinical trial at a time. That exclusion criteria that I'm talking about, part of that exclusion criteria will say, and this patient is not currently enrolled in another clinical trial. So think about all of these aspects if you're physicians trying to manage patients and really trying to really meet patients where they are, trying to give the absolute best care to everybody, regardless of their insurance status. And the fact of the matter is, all insurance is not equal. And what do I mean by that? I mean that all insurance is not equal. And that can determine what type of health care you get and what that means for you. So here's an example. If you have a cut rate insurance, maybe I'll use that term, because that's what you can afford, it generally then limits the number of visits that you can see a physician, limits the number of visits that you can see a specialist before you're paying out of pocket. So what do? You use your insurance judiciously based on what you can afford, not what your health needs. That's what I mean when I say all insurance is not equal. It doesn't mean that your doctor is treating you any differently. It means that you will tend to self-manage based on what you can afford. If your insurance is only allowing 3 visits, you probably aren't going to do 6, even if 6 are required, because you're going to have to pay out of pocket for 3. If your deductible is very high and you're not able to meet that, you are going to be cautious about where you put your healthcare dollars. That's very different from someone who has another type of commercial or private insurance that doesn't have those types of concerns, including a lower deductible, unlimited access to specialists. So if you have patients that you suspect are struggling with healthcare, instead of thinking that maybe they're non-compliant, maybe, as we know, there's so many social aspects to everybody's health. We know that your health is really determined by where you're living and how you're living as well. And we are shifting our thought to not necessarily taking care of patients when they're ill, when they're in the hospital, but when they're outside of the hospital and having all of these challenges that make you ill. And so this is one of the aspects when we talk about secrets of clinical trials. This is one of those secrets as well. What does that mean for all populations? If you are a patient, it's very difficult to advocate for yourself. When you come to see somebody like me, right? It might be nerve-wracking. This person knows more than I do. Maybe she's intimidating. I leave and I don't get all my questions answered because I thought she was finished talking and she shut me down, or I got nervous and forgot. So all kinds of things happen when you are in the office. But try to advocate for yourself for clinical trials, even if you just say, hey, doctor, I heard this lady talking about clinical trials, and I'm kind of interested in one for my autoimmune disease. I've got lupus, and I wouldn't mind investigating a clinical trial for my lupus, for my scleroderma. Do you know something about that? Your doctor may or may not know. Remember, we don't get trained on this in school, but your doctor, especially if they are affiliated with a large medical center, should be able to investigate that for you. You also can generally look these things up online, and we're working to try to have one area where all of these things can be found, but your doctor would be an excellent first resource if you're interested in that type of healthcare. And what I'm saying today, in the time that we have left, the key message that I really want to leave everybody with is that clinical trials provide better healthcare access. If you can get into a clinical trial, you have more people overseeing you. Those onerous visits, a lot of people don't like to come to clinical trials, right? Because you've got all these visits, you've got to come and see the doctor. All those visits are helping you. That's a privilege, not a burden. Now, that being said, I certainly understand that people have to take off from work, and you've got to find childcare, and you need transportation, and you may even need some funding for just parking and missing work. So here's another little secret. The clinical trials will give you a stipend for every time you come in to that visit. You will get money. And certainly, if you let your doctor or your research team know that I'm sort of struggling and I can't just keep coming because I'm missing work, or I've got to pay for a babysitter, or I can't pay for gas, or the parking at the hospital is astronomical, I can't pay for that every time I come, mention it. There is a stipend available for people enrolled in clinical trials. So these are all aspects that you may or may not know, that your doctor even may or may not know. But as you get more and more involved, I want you to begin to look at clinical trials, not in terms of experimentation or exploitation, but look at them in terms of access and improved healthcare as we move to whatever this post-COVID, post-endemic state is going to be. Understand that healthcare will change and has changed, and that your thought about how you're going to integrate healthcare into your life should change as well. So I hope that this has been helpful. It's 30 minutes, it goes really fast. Next month, April 25th, I am going to talk about clinical trials specifically for minority communities, specifically for populations of color, and what that means. I am going to have a guest, my good friend Cynthia Quarles. Sorry, she is a phenom, went to college with me, is a CABI representative, and guess what? Enrolls in clinical trials as a Black woman. So we're going to have somebody here and have a nice open dialogue about what it means to be in a clinical trial and what that experience is like, and why we should continue gaining knowledge about it and learning about it as we move forward. So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Again, I am back on April 25th, still talking about clinical trials. I will focus on populations of color, which is a lot of people here in the United States. Until then, thanks for coming. I'll see you next time.
Thank you.